Welcome back to Religion at Work. So far in this series, we've talked about two deep stories that are really prominent in American culture. The first, people should work, or they're bad people. The second, that people who receive welfare or other kinds of support without working are somehow bad people or are making irresponsible personal choices. Both of these stories are worth thinking twice about. A lot of people may see them as normal or natural in some way, but that's just because they've been repeated so many times by people in power. By now, you can see that these are actually just stories told by particular people in particular times and places, serving their own ends. And once you see that, you can begin to imagine alternatives to how this story could go.
Let's review what a deep story is and how to spot one at work. A deep story is a pattern, a kind of template that people use to draw connections and make meaning of things they experience. The characters can change, the details of the action can change, but the overall pattern of the plot remains the same. In our deep story, the overall pattern looks like this. People should work, or they're bad people. Look at how the details change, but the plot remains consistent. Puritan children should go to school and obey their parents, or they'll go to hell. Black people should work energetically to benefit the white economy, or they're subhuman. Native children should learn Anglo-European housekeeping, farming, and cultural norms, or they're uncivilized. People on welfare should be working or looking for work so they can support themselves independently, or they're lazy and irresponsible. We can see this pattern in plenty of other situations too. Think about how some people are talking about student loan forgiveness. People with student debt should work to pay it all off independently, or they're taking advantage of Americans who have made more responsible choices. This pattern draws really simple connections between three things: our work, our wealth, and our morality. It's a closed system. There's no room in the story for complicating factors like race, gender, generational wealth, access to education, and so on. And it all goes back to old white Protestant ideas about what work is and why we should do it. So what's the one weird trick for spotting a deep story? It starts with paying attention to how you feel. If you have a strong gut reaction to something, fear or outrage, or even a positive emotion like joy, that's a data point for you. It may not be immediately obvious why you feel that way, or you may be used to assuming it's a natural reaction. But notice what you're feeling, and pay attention to similar reactions in other situations. Then choose a key word or idea that comes up in multiple situations that prompt that reaction. We've explored a bunch of them in this series: welfare, motherhood, civilization, discipline, responsibility. You just need to pick one to start. Do some observation and research on how the people around you use that word now, and how people in your context have used it in the past. When did it become popular? Who was using it, and for what purpose? Then here's the trick. You ask the religion question. Find out which religious traditions have been powerful in your context, and see what they have to say about your key word. What religious stories do powerful people rely on to support their point of view? Chances are you'll find conflicting religious ideas, because no religion is homogeneous, and religions evolve over time. But you can identify which ideas were held by people with more political clout, financial resources, racial or gender privilege, and access to public platforms. There will be patterns in what they say. That's your deep story. Then you can trace it forward in time to see how it was normalized in society as the way things ought to be, not just one religious viewpoint. You may be thinking, okay, it makes sense that this deep story was religious for the Puritans, but I don't see anything religious about that view of welfare. Plenty of people who aren't religious think that way, and there's nothing in the deep story about Jesus or God or scripture. And in some ways you're right. You don't have to be Christian or white or American to be influenced by this deep story about work. But that doesn't mean it's not a religious story. It just means that its religious dimensions are hidden beneath the surface of what we see every day. You have to really stop and think about it and investigate where that pattern came from to see how religion is involved. See, religions aren't just about scriptures or worship or community. Religions envision an ideal world and train people to behave in ways that will fulfill that vision. When those people have the power to create laws and policies and nations, they will do so with that vision in mind. That's what's happened in the United States. White Protestant Christians basically were the government up until the 20th century, and they still retain disproportionate power compared to Americans of other races and religions. Their values infuse our laws, our policies, and our cultural norms in ways most Americans just take for granted. But Americans today aren't 17th century Puritans, or 19th century enslavers, or even 20th century Christian social reformers. Why should we organize our society according to their values? The problem with this deep story isn't that it's religious. The problem is that it normalizes discrimination and violence against women, people of color, and other marginalized groups. The problem is that it blames poor people for their disadvantages. The problem is that it baptizes an exploitative economic system as the way the world ought to be. The first step towards justice is seeing injustice. We need to understand how this deep story about work, money, and morality tells us how to feel about each other. We need to know where it comes from, how it has become so entrenched in our society. We need to assess if it's really a deep story we want to live by, knowing the harm that it does. And then the fun part begins. We get to imagine different ways of configuring that original closed system of work, money, and morality. We can tell a story where your worth as a person isn't connected to your wealth or employment status. It can be hard to imagine alternatives to the system many of us have grown up with, myself included. But humans are really creative, especially when we work collectively. We have lots of other ways of thinking about these topics already. Other religious traditions, including other varieties of Christianity, offer different moral visions for the world and strategies for how to get there. And it's not just religions that offer alternative moral visions for the world. This is what social justice movements do. Activist and writer Walida Imarisha says that all organizing is science fiction because it requires imagining a completely different world. And speaking of fiction, humans are really good at imagining other worlds in words and images. We can read and watch and experience those visions in literature and art of all kinds. They're more than just entertainment or commodities. They're a new way of seeing the world as it is and the world as it could be. When you're looking at this deep level of society, you're never looking at a single thing. Americans' ideas about work aren't produced just by settler colonialism, or just by anti-Black racism, or just by heteropatriarchy. It's not a Jenga tower. Taking one block down won't make the whole thing crumble. It's more like the way redwoods' roots intertwine to hold each other up. It's a complicated system, one that's reinforced itself over time. And religion is right there in the middle of it. You can understand a lot about injustice in the United States by paying attention to things like race, gender, disability, sexuality, and class. But you won't get the full picture unless you're also paying attention to religion, asking the religion question, because religion is always at work. Thanks for watching.